So at one level, you could say, well, this is great. Why can't I just sort of sit back, pop the champagne, and enjoy the savings? When you guys are ready with the technology, let me know. I'll buy the trucks and I'll enjoy the savings. The problem is that innovation doesn't work that way. Right? Those are not savings that are going to go to everyone. Those are the savings that go to those who figure out how to capture them first and faster than the others. So we have a long history of technologies that at one level seem like they would be just great benefit to existing market leaders, but have changed the business models and operating environments in those industries to destroy market leaders. So if you think about technology, Kodak literally invented the technology behind digital cameras. But for 30 years, they could never shift their business and operating model to take advantage of that technology, and disappeared. So it was not a lack of understanding of the technology. It was an inability to adapt to that technology over time. Newspaper industry thought that the internet would simply be a great, better, faster, cheaper channel between their customers, advertisers, and consumers. And for years, they would argue that the internet is a good thing, not a bad thing. And of course, we know that the newspaper industry has been destroyed by internet advertising. Right? To the point where the Washington Post, the iconic Washington Post, was sold a few months ago for $250 million to the man who built the Kindle. Ironic in that. $250 million, that purchase price of the Post, you put that in context, was less than 0.1% of the market value of Google at the time. Borders thought the internet was nothing more than a better channel to the consumers, to the extent that initially they outsourced their online sales to Amazon. And they could never develop business and operating models that integrated that new technology, that new channel, with their existing businesses, and went out of business. So what I want to make sure we do in the course of talking about the technology in front of us is to realize that we're not just talking about faster, better, cheaper trucks. We're talking about technology that can change the whole ecosystem around those trucks. So when you decide whether or not you want to experiment with this technology, when you decide whether or not you want to invest in the adoption of this technology, know that the ecosystem around you doesn't stand still. The trucks and the capabilities will change the expectation of the shippers, of your customers. It'll change how you operate. There are a whole series of questions that you'll have to get right in order to take advantage of the technology. And they're very hard questions. Right? They're questions around how you reimagine logistics and supply chains. They're questions like these. What are the economics involved in the new businesses that incorporate this technology? How does it affect industry structure? Is it going to drive a wave of consolidation, where it's better to be big and therefore there are players that will get bigger and bigger and bigger? Or will somebody be able to create network effects that take advantage of alliances of small players through information technology and data and logistics, all the things you'll be talking about over the course of this event? What is the new customer behavior, right, in the context of this technology? So the guys from Google have to worry very hard about how drivers interact with this technology at one level, and Anthony, I think we'll talk a lot about the interface. I'm talking about a different level of interaction, different level of customers. Right? How do shippers change their expectations around you? How do they change how they organize their activities? How do they change their values around how they evaluate how you serve them? That kind of customer behavior will naturally change. How do you organize? How do you organize your business? How do you organize your assets? How do you distribute them? How do you develop the infrastructure to get your vehicles to the right point at the right time in this new context? And how do you transition? Right? How do you think about this large capital investment that will change not only your investment profiles, but also change how the industry rolls over its fleet over time? These are all elements of how you capture the value, which you'll have to think about at the same time as you think about the technology itself. So one of the things I want to do is I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about how, in those other contexts, and generally, how do you think about innovation? Because I think that's what it all comes down to. How do you innovate in the context of this kind of disruptive technology? So if I were to boil it down to 6 words, I would say this. You do this by thinking big, starting small, and learning fast. The companies that succeed do that, and the companies that fail do not. So thinking big means that you step back. You're willing to think about all the possibilities. You're willing to think about how might somebody using this technology drive you out of business? You're willing to think about how, if I started with a clean sheet of paper, how might my organization, my strategy look? It's not that you move to that clean sheet of paper overnight, but you at least have a better sense of where you're going. By contrast, the companies that fail tend to think small. They tend to think that the next version of the adoption of the technology is just an incremental change over the existing one. Right? So Borders thinks that the internet is just another channel to their customers. Right? Newspapers think that it's just another way of interacting. I get a little bit more efficient, I take away the paper, but I'm still delivering ads the way I always did. Right? It's human nature. It's human nature to assume that things change incrementally because that's what we're optimized for. We're optimized around what we do, and we want it to change slowly. Now, the companies that succeed after they think big, they also do not then jump on the bandwagon and say, I have a great idea, I'm just going to chase down as hard as possible. They break it down. They say, okay, where are the uncertainties? How do I take a scientific process here where I break it down and try to uncover the uncertainties? How do I experiment? The companies that think small tend to fall into a quandary because they've been complacent for so long, then at some point, they feel like they're behind and they just bet as big as they can on the first thing they can reach. So I'll give you another example. Blockbuster, for years, laughed at Netflix. There's a story that's told about how at one point, the guys at Netflix are running out of cash. They go and try to do a deal with Blockbuster, and they're literally laughed out of the office. Right, so for years, Blockbuster ignored Netflix, until one day they realized that they were falling behind. So they made a big bet on their own DVD by mail system, implemented it, rolled it out before they were ready. And not only was it an operational mess, it destroyed their previous business model, which relied a great deal on late fees. Right? So they were very complacent, and then they ran out of time, and they had to jump in big and bet big. That's a typical failure story. Now, successes after they think big, start small, do the most important thing, and this is the thing that I would urge you to think about, is how do you learn fast? How do you create an environment where you can create as many learning cycles as possible? Because we're in an age of uncertainty where the answer will never be clear at the beginning. What you have to do is you have to be able to experiment and learn and navigate through the process. So if you only get one rep at it, you're not going to do much learning. And that's what happens to companies that fail. They have no time for learning. They just have to implement as fast as they can. So how do you think big, start small, and learn fast in the context of this technology? Because I think one of the things you'll conclude after our discussion today is that it's very real, it's not science fiction, and I have a lot of time. Because it's not going to be implemented overnight, and there's a lot of complexity to be worked out. Now the question is, after you decide whether or not you have a lot of time, do you then say, let me take advantage of that time, or do you wait? There's a fascinating study that was done at Kodak in the early 1980s that looked at digital photography. And it was done by a gentleman who had just come back from being the director of the U.S. Census. A tremendous market researcher. He did an analysis that essentially said, digital photography, we have 7 years before it crosses the threshold where it might be a threat to us, based upon costs of printing, quality of printing, interaction between devices, things of that sort. We have 7 years before we have to worry about. And here are the markers where we know we'll get in trouble, like the density of the chips, the quality of the prints, things of that sort. So management said, great, we have 7 years, we don't have to worry about it. So what did they do over that 7 years? Actually, what did they do over the next 17 years? Nothing. And that's the danger you want to avoid. You'll find at the end of this session that you have a lot of time, but that doesn't mean that it's time to wait. It's time to experiment, it's time to learn. So what we're going to talk about in a little bit is a lot of different models about autonomous vehicles and connected trucks. And there are people in the room developing alternative models. And we can't tell you whether any of those are right. We can't tell you whether or not any of those are right because nobody knows yet. It depends on a lot of factors that need to be still worked out. But we know that the way you can learn, the way you can get into it, is by thinking big, starting small, and learning fast, not by thinking small and waiting. So, because ultimately, what you want to be is, we know at the end of the next 10, 15 years, there's going to be a lot of big winners and there's going to be a lot of big losers. We don't know who they are yet, but we will not have a replication of the existing industry structure or business models. We're going to have something different. And the question is, can you transition? Right? Because ultimately, you don't want to be like the Washington Post. You want to be like the Googles and the Amazons, right, that are in the game and capture that value as opposed to losing that value. Thank you.